Welcome everybody to When Nature Sets the Communications Agenda. My name is Sophie Duncan. I work at the National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement, and we are really passionate about helping and supporting people to engage with the public. So this is going to be a really interesting and thoughtful session, I think. Today we're going to be hearing two case studies, one about the heat waves in 2002, which you will remember, I am sure, that hit Britain and which we had to face over a projected length of time. And then the second about Storm Arwen, which again, I'm sure you'll remember from latter part of last year, and particularly if you're in the north of England. And so during this session, there'll be a chance to hear about those case studies, and then you can join us in a conversation with the speakers to explore some of the dynamics of what does it mean to communicate well in the case of a nature event, and particularly a profound nature event that affects so many lives. To kick us off, I'm going to ask you to say hi in chat and tell us something about yourself. So I think today we'll look at what's your favorite kind of wildlife creature. So tell us, what's your, just say hi. Tell us, what's your favorite wildlife, whether a bird, an animal. So Sam, he loves lobsters. Oh yeah, I'm quite a fan of lobsters. I once saw a blue lobster. I was very excited to see a blue lobster. Oh, Jenny's migratory fish. Brilliant. Ellie, a big fan of bears. Sophie loves frogs. Oh, another Shandin loves bears too, as to Rosa's likes wolves. Naomi, pine martins. Alice, beavers. Oh, brilliant. Vicky saying you can't choose. European eels are pretty cool. I know nothing of European eels. I will look them up, Vicky. Susanna likes a hedgehog. Oh, who doesn't love a hedgehog? Miriam, a red kite. Blair saying an octopus. Alice, bumblebees. And they're so critical, aren't they? Kate, another eels fan. Oh, Justin, another octopus fan. Alice is liking bears. Oh my gosh. Layla is from Forestry, England. Curlew. So perhaps they know you, Mark. Ben saying puffins. Henry's dogs. Kiera, oh, choosing it so hard. Cat beavers. Andy, okay. Red squirrels, brilliant. Jenny, the nuthatches running up and down the trees in your garden. I'm imagining that's exciting you, Grahame, with your background in the RSPCA. I can't even remember the letters. Oh, that's really bad. The organisation that love birds. I'm sorry, I'm getting myself muddled. Joe into buzzards. Oh, Alice, don't make me choose. Frogs, hedgehogs, tree creepers. Hamish is a nuthatch. Gary, RSPB, thank you for reminding me of the letters. How could I have forgotten? How could I have forgotten? I've been a member for years. That's just embarrassing. So Gary's flamingos. Oh yes, very exotic. Thank you, Kiera, really helping me there with RSPB. Grahame, lichens. Oh, you've brought in something. Yeah, brilliant. Lichens. I'm glad that we've had a flag for lichens. Really important. Ida dragonflies. Oh, Alice, are you suggesting I haven't had enough coffee? I'm not on it already. Oh, and Amy loving sharks. Oh, isn't it nice to hear about what everybody loves? So Grahame, what do you love? What wildlife do you love?
Peregrine falcons have got to be a favourite, but I would say dolphins now. I've just started guiding on a ship that runs between North Devon and Lundy, and the joys of seeing dolphins and pointing them out to people that haven't seen them for the first time is amazing.
Brilliant, brilliant. And what about you, Mark? I didn't tell you I was going to ask you this, but you've had a lot of inspiration from our lovely delegates.
Red squirrels for me.
Red squirrels. Do you know, the first time I saw a red squirrel was in the Cairngorms with actually somebody who used to work for the RSPB who took me there looking for spiders, but that's another story. Okay, so without more ado, I'm going to hand over to Grahame Madge. Now, Grahame Madge, for those of you who don't know him, is a senior press officer and climate spokesman, which I think must be quite a challenging job, being a climate spokesperson at the Met Office. And before that, he worked for many years at the RSPB in a similar role, working in communications. And he's going to be talking to us a little bit about a case study on the heat waves that happened last year. So Grahame, over to you.
Thank you, Sophie. While I'm trying to sort this out, I'll just give a quick introduction. And basically that is to say that obviously the heat wave was an extremely significant event. Many people will have their own memories of that particular event. It affected many people's lives. But what I'm going to do is to actually talk about it in a communications context. And so, yes, as I was saying, it was a very significant event, unprecedented, in fact. If we could move on to the first slide, please. So what I want to do is just to give you a little bit about the context to some of the communications challenges that the Met Office faced. We were fortunate to be able to have a good forecast, a good handle on what was going to happen. And the week previous to the event, we could see that we were likely to reach or even exceed temperatures which had been recorded before. And that was obviously hugely significant. And also we were aware that if we did see the temperatures realized of 40 degrees C or more, that we would really have very strong evidence that climate change was affecting our extreme weather events, because not only had that not been recorded before, but a study that was done showed that that was unlikely to have been achieved in a pre-industrial atmosphere before it started to be loaded with greenhouse gases. The event itself, the heat wave period of extreme heat, took place just after the weekend, but on the Friday before, the Met Office issued its first extreme heat red warning, which obviously was, from a communications point of view, a very clear call that we were expecting something unique. Can I have the next slide, please? The challenge that we faced was twofold. So first of all, this was a life-threatening spell of weather. There were challenges of people saying, oh, this is just the summer Met Office. What are you worried about? This is normal conditions. But we knew that it was going to reach potentially life-threatening levels, hence the red warning. But also we needed to communicate that climate change is becoming an increasingly strong influence on extreme weather events in the UK. But we needed to communicate that without the distraction from the threat to life messaging. So there was two very clear pillars that we needed to communicate. And there was a risk that if we only did one of them, that the public may only hear the climate message and actually ignore the warning, which would be disastrous. Can I have the next slide, please? So several days ahead, we were able to forecast with the red warning. During the event itself, this is the timeline of the heat wave and the warning, we dealt with a huge volume of media inquiries, both from a meteorological and also a climate perspective. We're very fortunate at the Met Office that we have a very engaged creative content team, and they were busy producing infographics, social media tiles, and video explainers. And we had the fortune of having vast amounts of data that we're able to share. And then after the event, we were able to focus on the record-breaking heat and put that event into a historical context, while commenting that this is the first time it's happened, but it won't be the last for sure. Next slide, please. Key messages. Heat wave will be an extreme event, and unlike the weather the UK has experienced before, this isn't just a nice day, this is climate-induced extreme weather. We were keen to amplify the messages from our civil contingency partners, police, all of the agencies and organisations that we work with, obviously the health professionals, that people need to take care that this heat wave is extreme and that there will be health risks, disruption, and indeed was the case, mortality. Another key message was to reinforce the link with climate change. We when we had the last extreme weather back in 2019, and we had the record of 38.7 degrees, which was a new national record, our climate scientists did what we call an attribution study, which was basically to show the potential of 40 degrees occurring in a natural atmosphere compared with one that's laden with greenhouse gases. So we had good science to be able to pull through, which was a fantastic resource for us to have. And finally, the message was that we expect these events more in future as climate change becomes increasingly dominant in our atmosphere. Next slide, please. The tactics, we don't use our chief executive very much for media. We tend to either put forward our climate scientists and experts or our, obviously our meteorologists and weather experts. But on this occasion, we decided that it was appropriate to use our chief exec, who made a video with our creative team, and we felt it was right to give that authority to this message, that it was something very serious, and that message obviously came from the top. Using our visualization system, we had a huge amount of graphics, stills and animations that we were able to show the event unfolding and the areas at risk. In the press office, which is obviously the domain where I work, we were busy leading the media and guiding them to the stories, and obviously the media coverage was huge. And then just a couple of other things, the information coming through from the event. So we were posting regularly about the temperatures that had been achieved across the UK countries. And then in the middle is my colleague Aidan McGivern, who had previously presented something about the chance of extreme heat based on Glastonbury in 2050. But that was another useful resource to pull through to show that this wasn't just a one-off and that we can expect repeated events in future. Next slide, please. On reflection, the heat wave gave many people across the UK their first indication that climate change is happening now. I don't think there can be many people who, when they experience the heat wave, can be in any doubt that the climate is now affecting our atmosphere in a significant way. And indeed, you know, the impacts of seeing things like wildfire in London was truly shocking. And I think also, you know, a key point to take out of this is that the Met Office's reputation for accurate and timely forecasting, I think, was boosted in the eyes of the public. You know, we really did get this one right. And also, I think our reputation with government and our important civil contingency partners was also greatly enhanced as a result of the work that our meteorologists and experts put into this. Next slide, please. This slide is a result of the climate work that was done. It's rather confusing at first glance, but we've tried to make it into a simple infographic if we can. The red line shows the potential of the UK to see 40 degrees C days. If you look to the past, the chances compared with the axis on the left, you can see that historically there wasn't really a chance. We're talking about 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000. Whereas if we go to the right and look at the period towards 2100, you can actually see that the chances of experiencing the weather that we saw this July, when we get to the end of the century, we could be experiencing that level of heat, something like every 3 to 4 years. At the moment, it's just about possible. So we've put it at about a 1 in 100 chance. So clearly, even before climate change, this would have been a hugely extreme event. But with the loading of the atmosphere, then we can expect these events more and more. Next slide, please. I'm just showing some basic information here. So this is a plot on the right of all of the temperatures that were recorded that exceeded the temperature in Cambridge a few years ago in 2019. And you can see it wasn't just one exceedance. That's normally what we'd expect when we get a new record, that you maybe get 1 or 2 weather stations recording a new record, as was the case indeed at Cambridge Botanic Garden in 2019. But here we had dozens of stations recording well above the previous record of 38.7, I think it was. Yes, and it was significant that, you know, we had stations all the way from Yorkshire right down to the south of England exceeding it, which was really, again, not only was the event unprecedented, but to exceed that level of temperatures in one single event was also really unprecedented. The chart on the left shows the timeline, and it shows the top 10 hottest UK days on record. And you can see back in 1911, there was one that got to 36.7 at Raunds in Northamptonshire. That was at that time an extreme event. But as we go to the right, you can see as we get towards present day, the cluster begins to develop, and you can actually see more and more of the hottest days actually occurring really since 2000. And obviously this year we had two of the hottest top 10 days. The peak day when we got to 40.3 at Coningsby in Lincolnshire, but also we had another day, the day before actually at Santondown, where we got to 38.1. So it was a significant, very widespread event, but is becoming more frequent. Next slide,
That's
please.
10 minutes, Grahame.
Okay, I'll just show the next one. Two, actually, sorry. This shows temperatures across the UK, the actual values. So you can see there on the map on the left is the 10th of August 2003, which was a very hot day. And you can see the heat wave focused to the southeast. If we shift to the 25th of July, you can see that the heat is more intense. That was the day at 38.7 at Cambridge. And if I can just quickly show the next slide to put this into context, these are the 2 days of the heat wave. So you can see that the heat intensity is much more significant and indeed widespread, all parts of the UK being affected. And indeed on the 19th, you can see it even more intensely. And one interesting fact here is that our designers and meteorologists had to work together to actually increase the color scale, which is why it goes into that sort of earthy brown colors, because we'd used the color scale up through the purples. So we actually, this is, you know, climate change impacting on our design work, because we're having to see, you know, increase the color scales on our maps just to account for the increase in temperatures that we're seeing. I'll bring it to a close there. I do have some other graphics which maybe we can come on and cover during questions, but I'll leave it there for the moment and hand back to Sophie. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Grahame, and really interesting to hear how that extreme weather event really affected your comms, and also even how you demonstrate your comms. And Dan saying that their partner had their baby on the 19th of July, but were fortunately in South Devon, so they were a little bit cooler. So I think we probably all remember what we were doing, but perhaps you particularly, Dan. I'm just going to give you just a minute to there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. I'm going to suggest you open that up and think, do you have a question that's been inspired by what Grahame's just said? So if you just want to pop that down into that Q&A place, then we'll come to those in a minute, and then I'll be coming over to Mark. So I'll just give you a minute just to think of your questions. And if you see a question that someone else has posed that you also want to know the answer to, then do put a thumbs up on the question. And that really helps us if we don't have time to cover everybody's questions. And I suggest, Grahame, you might want to have a quick look at those questions before we come to it, so that you've got a little bit of preparedness. Okay, so we've heard about one extreme weather event, now to hear about another, and I'm very pleased to introduce Mark Holroyd, who is, I got a bit excited about this, head of recreation. Who wouldn't want to be head of recreation? Head of recreation and communications for the north of England, and he's going to be talking a little bit about Storm Arwen. And before we came together onto the webinar, I asked him what was his passion. So Grahame told me his passion was wildlife, and Mark's passion is the north of England and the people who live there. So I wonder if you just want to tell us in the chat, are you from the north of England? You from, you know, like, do you have experience of this wondrous place that Mark is a part of? Tell us in the chat. We'd love to hear from you, and you are especially welcome today. And Mark, tell us what's so great about the north of England.
Hi everyone. Thanks, Sophie. Well, I just love the people, really, and it's a lot of the places in the north of England still have a really strong sense of place, a really strong sense of community, and there are wonderful natural landscapes and places that people can enjoy. I'm from the Lake District originally, and I've been down south and I've come back up, and you know, every day I feel really appreciative for where I live. So.
And
yeah,
we've had a few people saying that either they've been born in Hull, you know, one's in Humberside, somebody in Scotland but's got family in Leeds, somebody in Gateshead, somebody who studied in Sheffield and miss it, you know. So yeah, so some really nice kind of people who have connections to the north of England. So over to you, Mark. Tell us about Storm Arwen.
Great. Hopefully you can see my slides. Are they showing?
Sorry, Mark. Yes, everything's
Yes.
showing really well.
Brilliant.
Yes.
Okay, so hi everyone. So I'm going to be talking about Storm Arwen and how it affected the nation's forests in the north of England. So I'm sure you all know that Forestry England, we're the agency of the Forestry Commission that manages the nation's forests, or used to be known as the Public Forest Estate, for the benefit of people, wildlife, and the climate. So the business unit that I work in is the north of England. We manage about a third of the nation's forests. Around 86,000 hectares of land across Northumberland, Cumbria, Durham, Gateshead and Lancashire, and about 61,000 hectares of that is forest, and great for timber production, but very much at the forefront of our mind is engaging people with nature, and the places that we manage are in important areas for tourism, but also we have forests right next to urban communities in parts of Gateshead and Newcastle as well. So Storm Arwen, it's a manual. Storm Arwen was a pretty significant weather event for us. It hit the north of England on the 26th and 27th of November last year. It was a Met Office. There was a Met Office red warning in place for the northeast coast of England and Scotland, with amber warnings and yellow warnings across most of the rest of the north of England. It was pretty well forecasted. We knew it was happening, but we hadn't quite. To be honest, we've had a bit of alert blindness, and we weren't quite as organised as we should have been in some places. It led to very significant wind blow, damage to trees, woods and forests right across the north of England, but particularly focused in Northumberland, the areas around Kielder Forest, the largest forest in England, and Rothbury, which is a series of communities in sort of north central Northumberland. And then in the south central Lake District, so around Grisdale Forest and the Windermere Coniston area, suffered the most significant damage. And it's only really in the last few months that we've got a proper sense of the scale of the damage. It's taken quite a long time to use satellite imagery, aerial footage and experiences on the ground to bring an accurate number to what happened. But around 2,300 hectares of forests were severely damaged, and that ranged from whole or significant areas of forest falling over, so hitting the deck, as shown in some of these pictures here, but also quite complex damage from broadleaf tree, very large broadleaf trees falling across infrastructure, landing on top of each other in complex arrangements, a little bit like pickup sticks or a game of Kaplunk, and leading to pretty difficult damage right across the area to infrastructure, but also in terms of loss of timber value, future timber value, which is important to the financial sustainability of our organisation and the timber supply chain that follows. So there was some quite significant operational challenges for us. Just over the weekend of it happening, there was an incident with a motorsport event which had finished in time for the storm, but a clear-up crew became trapped overnight in the middle of the storm in Kielder Forest. That was sort of an immediate emergency. But over the sort of 2 weeks that followed, we had very significant power outages. I think across the north of England, there were about 114,000 homes without power, but that significantly affected our ability to respond to the incident. We had 2 villages in particular, Kielder village, and Satterthwaite in the Lake District, which are surrounded entirely by our forests and home to a lot of our staff, which were cut off from power, and in Kielder's case, water for 8 days. All our mobile phone reception was cut off, and our backup radio systems were out of action. So it became very, very difficult to gather information about exactly what was happening across the north, across our estate, and build a full picture to respond to media inquiries, and really actually to explain to our own organisation what was taking place and the significance of it. There was quite significant public risk from trees that were hung up, or areas of forest that were risky for people to enter. So there were quite a number of closures we had to implement, trail closures, site closures, and just explaining to the public at large that there was a risk from falling trees after the event. And there were subsequent storm events that followed right through the winter and spring season that led to further trees falling down. And indeed, there remains a residual risk as we go into this winter. So just on the comms side, just the key areas we needed to think about. So first was, and this often gets overlooked in responding to a communications emergency, but our internal audiences, our internal staff across the organisation, we needed to understand where our staff were and check on their welfare. There were quite a lot of staff went off grid because they live in remote locations and were cut off or trapped in their properties. We needed to try and work out where they were and ensure that everyone is safe. Get our teams safe and ensure they're okay. And then reiterate really strong health and safety messages to everybody. So this was a big scale event, quite emotional. Things that at a scale of event that our staff haven't seen for quite a long time. So just calming everybody down, showing some leadership, not unleashing, sending everybody out to go and sort all the problems out in one go, calming everything down so that we respond in a planned and sensible way. And then in that, managing lone working effectively. And then explaining to the rest of the organisation what's happening, so that they understand what we're dealing with and can support effectively. Then there's our community and residential audiences. So we're not a civil contingency responder anymore. We're not necessarily plugged into what the fire service and the police and the local authorities are doing, but we did have a role to play in enabling access for them and using some of our infrastructure and expertise to help them deal with the immediate emergency and restoring power and utility supplies, safeguarding vulnerable residents. And I think a lesson learned is that we need to be better trained and plugged into how those other agencies work. And then in the months following the event, managing expectations around recovery. The scale of the damage means that there's actually a limit on the number of people that can go and deal with some of this stuff, limited contractors. So regular communication with parish councils and communities and visitors around what's open, when's it likely to be open, and taking it through from there so that people can get back to walking their dogs and as soon as they can. So those issues of public safety were very high in our minds at the shortly after the event, and we reverted to a lot of those classic on the ground measures, signs and tape, to explain to people where sites are closed, where trails are closed. You can't get better than members of staff explaining to regular dog walkers what's happened and the risks involved, and then using our local social media channels to enhance that. You being the nation's, so the government's forestry advisors, putting our expert voice out there to explain some of the immediate risks from leaning trees, dangerous trees, just in that immediate week or so after the event. So I was on the Jeremy Vine show. We had people on various radio stations, BBC News, trying to just explain some of the risks, but doing it in a careful way that we didn't discourage people from going out and enjoying the countryside. We had to be quite conscious this was a regionally significant event, not a whole country event. And so that was quite a challenge to get that balance right. We could only really do that for a week or two. Hard to sustain that.
That's 10 minutes, Mark.
Okay, nearly there. Just to say that there was also an element of around managing our stakeholders and reputation. There, a couple of weeks after the event, some of those follow-up pieces where journalists were starting to ask about why has this happened, and there was a suggestion that it was around some of the conifer broadleaf debates that rumble on in the conservation and forestry sector around species mix and things like that. And we really wanted to get ahead of that and really stress that this was a natural event. One of our foresters used the term nature's thinning. Big storms happen, and actually good can come from that in terms of allowing forests to regenerate, restructure, and overall improve the forest resilience. But just to say, there is a happy ending coming. Most of our forests were reopened by the summer holidays. There are some that remain partially closed, particularly in Northumberland. Probably the cost is around £7 to £10 million to our business over the next 5 years. But we are in the process of restoring that recreational infrastructure, mountain bike trails, walking trails. And that gives us opportunity to rebuild some of that infrastructure in a more resilient way, in a way that provides more opportunities for more people to enjoy the countryside and our forests. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks, Mark. And another really good example of dealing with an extreme weather event and how you manage that. I'm just going to give people just a few seconds to put any questions specifically for Mark or for both Mark and Grahame into the Q&A and to upvote stuff that they're interested in. And after that time is finished, I'm going to come to you, Grahame, with the question from Emily Weatherburn, which I'm assuming you can see. And I'm going to ask you both the question by Beccas Smith. So if you put them in most upvotes order, they're the top 2 in most upvotes order in the Q&A. I will ask you them out loud, but just so that you can prepare. So any other questions that you want to add on, just take a couple of seconds to do that. And we will then try and answer some of these questions. Great. Then, Grahame, Emily says, when I speak to people outside of the industry, they quite often reflect on the really good weather, in inverted commas, we had in the summer and talk about how lucky we were, not linking it to climate change.
So, yes, I do have some thoughts on this. There was a lot of pushback at the time from people that were saying, oh, we've had this before. We had, heat wave in 1976 and everybody coped with it. But the difference here is the fact that, people were trying to work, people were, with health problems especially, were struggling with this. And it wasn't normal weather. I think anybody that experienced it realized that it wasn't pleasant weather, which probably ends around 32, 33 degrees for many people, and got to a point where it was extreme. And I think we have a bit of catching up to do for people to realize that, you know, those days when you get, like we saw in 1976, temperatures of peaking around 36, we're now going to be peaking above 40, which that extra 4 degrees is a matter, I'm afraid, of life and death for some people. So it's not pleasant weather to enjoy, especially if you're trying to work or have a health condition, or, you know, trying to live your life. If you're on holiday in Mallorca, it might be bearable, but if you're trying to live a normal life in the UK, it's much, much more challenging.
Great. Thank you, Grahame. And now to Beccas question. So, and I'm going to come to you first, Mark. What channels did you find were most effective when communicating messages quickly, accurately, and effectively?
Yeah, so in the immediate aftermath, it was around making people aware of the problems with individual locations and sites. And I would say that there's signs on the ground is the things we reach, is the thing we reach for first in these events, but they're, after a couple of days, they're ignored quickly. So it's if we can, it's putting rangers in car parks, which is the, you can't get better than somebody explaining this stuff face to face. After that, it's been local and regional social media, and being brave to go beyond our own channels to reach into some of those community social media groups to really take messages to local people, which I would say in the immediate aftermath is quite important. I think a lot about regional media, and we would always do that, but I question, you know, it's tailed off, I think, in my view, in terms of its reach into large audiences, I think, and be interesting to hear other people's reflections on that.
And it was interesting, I noted a question that hasn't been upvoted very high, but just that sense of, had the extreme weather event of Storm Arwen hit the south or the southeast, would it have made more national coverage? And whether you had any reflections about, you know, the fact that actually maps wasn't taken as seriously by people living other parts of the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've reflected on that in some of our emergency planning as an organisation, really, that the government emergency planning is very much focused on reacting in different ways depending on how many people live there. And this was a very rural event. Although the power situation did get quite a lot of government attention, the other aspects of damaged infrastructure, and we're probably at the softer end of some of that, didn't really get any recognition, or much recognition or coverage. And yeah, so there is a bit of a north-south thing there, for obvious reasons.
Thanks, Mark. And what about you, Grahame? What channels did you find most effective?
So we like to operate a policy of pushing really messages through media. Obviously, that's a traditional route and a very effective one. But then we also have a counterweight of our own channels and our own social media, because one of the challenges, perennial challenge that we find at the Met Office, is that some of our dearly beloved tabloid journalist colleagues like to sensationalize the weather. It's obviously a key area for driving engagement, and we get a lot of sensationalist reporting, which isn't helpful when you're trying to have cut through on a clarity of message. So what we are investing in increasingly is our reach on our own channels, so that when the noise gets too much in public media, we can have comms on our blog, obviously our own press releases, but across our own social media channels that present our version of the truth, so that we can refer and point people to that if the tabloid media start to get too carried away with some of the stories. Perhaps not so much a case with heat wave, but particularly with snow. That is a perennial challenge. And that's a recipe that we find, you know, is the best way of trying to deal with the sort of, dare I say it, some of the fake news agenda.
Great, thank you. And as I think Alice was asking, do you evaluate which of the approaches that you take has most effect in terms of the things you care about achieving through your comms? And if so, what works best in this context, Grahame or Mark?
I wish I had time to evaluate things other than just my own personal reflections and the reflections of colleagues. These things are rarely a structured, nice, neatly structured campaign, but definitely communications evaluation should form part of reviewing an incident, a major incident, I think.
If I can just come in, we possibly don't do enough evaluation of the channels and tactics that we use, but we're fortunate that with our Public Weather Service agreement, there is a regular market research survey that goes out to find out how people interacted with the forecasts and whether did they find it accurate, what was their levels of trust. So we know that the overall comms mix that we're putting out is right, and obviously if there's anything that goes awry within the findings of that survey, then we do have a chance to tweak things. But I think you can never really have enough evaluation to fully understand the value of comms and the messages that you're getting across. So yes, we do a lot, but more would be good.
Great, thanks, Grahame. And so we're coming to the end of our webinar. So we've got 2 minutes left. So I'm going to ask you a question and about how you dealt with any negative reactions from climate change deniers in how you managed your communications. And as well as that question, so if you could think of that question, and then one top tip for our delegates today about how they might manage comms in a similar context. And I'll come to you first, Grahame, is that all right?
Yes, of course.
Vaguely like you wanted to answer first.
Okay, yes, I did. So climate denial is a big thing for us, and it exists in many forms, from some of the pundits on some of the far right TV channels to individuals that are motivated by their own cause. We're fortunate that we can largely cut through, and the more responsible sections of the media tend to moderate. But it can be a challenge, but I don't think we've ever lost coverage as a result of climate denial particularly. So it's there, it's a persistent threat, but it's not one that we really are too heavily focused on. But one of the things that we are learning in terms of the fake news agenda is to fill the void, because fake news breeds in the void. And by that, I mean with perhaps some of our longer range forecasts where there might be less confidence about weather solutions. So we're actually moving our comms and looking at trying to fill the void, which for us is a sort of forecast beyond 7 to 10 days, and actually populate that space with any information that we can to just try and shut down that fake news agenda. So at least we have something to say, and we are filling the space, and that, touch wood, seems to be working for us at the moment.
Great, thanks, Grahame. Mark, if you could be brief, we're quite on time now.
Yeah, I think we haven't really had much experience of that climate change denial in relation to this incident, and forest management is quite frontline in terms of dealing with climate change, and it's rarely, I think that aspect is rarely disputed. It's quite practical in that sense.
And your top tip, Mark?
Lean on non-operational colleagues, perhaps from other areas, to help provide a bit of perspective in these incidents. So emotions on the ground will be running really high. The temptation will be to want to close everything down and put up the barriers and say no, but use other colleagues to help you get that perspective. And just, in our sense, it was a locally significant incident that will live on for a long time, but it wasn't a national scale, and the forests have reopened and life will go on. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Grahame, in 10 seconds or less, your top tip.
I think I'd come back to my point about the fake news, actually, because that is the biggest challenge that we face, and try and recognize the value of comms and fill any vacuums. the less space you leave them, the less room they have to fester, would be my.
Oh, I love that.
top tip.
The less space you leave them, the less room they have to fester. I love it. What a great
Lovely
way
image.
to end. What a lovely way to end. I encourage Grahame and Mark, particularly Grahame, I think a couple of people made suggestions to you in the chat, so worth you taking a copy of the chat before you go. And other than that, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sorry we didn't cover all of your questions, but I hope you found it a really rewarding session, and enjoy the rest of the conference.